Well, I realized earlier that this is the first time that I have stood in this pulpit to preach a sermon looking at all of you for the first time since February of 2020. It's been a long time. Hi. Yeah. If we have any hope of transforming the world and changing ourselves, we must be loving enough to forgive ourselves and others. 2 weeks ago, the Reverend Ruth Mackenzie, our minister in residence, introduced us to these words, part of A Prayer for Living in Tension by the Reverend Joseph Cherry, who writes, "If we have any hope of transforming the world and changing ourselves, we must be bold enough to step into our discomfort, brave enough to be clumsy there, loving enough to forgive ourselves and others. May we, as a people of faith, be granted the strength to be so bold, so brave, and so loving." And today we conclude this series by delving into the challenging but oh so necessary practice of forgiveness. When I think about times in my life that I have been uncomfortable and clumsy and have had to forgive myself and others, my mind goes to the experience of facilitating workshops on racism and other forms of oppression. In the early 2000s, as a pretty young, emerging young adult, I was trained to lead such workshops for Unitarian Universalist youth and young adults, with the goal of helping participants to learn more and more deeply understand the impact of racism and oppression on their own lives and their communities, to unlearn the harmful patterns that they had internalized, and to equip them to work for justice. Most of these workshops took place in multiracial settings with people of many different identities, both privileged and marginalized, coming together to learn and connect around our shared commitment to transforming the world and ourselves. These workshops required tremendous vulnerability on the part of both the participants and the facilitators. And vulnerability is uncomfortable. We often reminded participants of this, that they may experience discomfort during the workshop, and encouraged especially those in privileged positions to sit with that discomfort and to see what they might learn from it. 2 particular workshops remain seared in my memory because they got messy. Something I said, the way I interacted with a co-facilitator who was a person of color, or the way that my co-facilitators and I had designed the program ended up being hurtful. When things went sideways, I reacted very strongly, both emotionally and physically. I had to step away from the workshop for a little bit. I was having the closest thing I think that I've experienced to a panic attack. My memories of these moments are very vivid and visceral. I remember at one workshop sitting on the front steps on a busy city street as cars and people rushed by, trying to calm my breathing enough to process what had gone wrong between me and my co-facilitator. And at another, walking on paths at a rural retreat center with one of my mentors, trying to think clearly about how to proceed, how to go back inside and talk with my co-facilitators about shifting our plan to do what we had intended in a way that worked for the group that we had. The way I reacted in those situations of brave clumsiness was not terribly helpful. I started beating myself up about it, convinced that I had done something irreparable and unforgivable. I've grown a lot since then, and I like to think that when I mess up these days, I tend to handle it better. It takes practice, though. Learning how to respond to that kind of messiness with grace instead of panic. Practicing this response builds the muscles within us that move our hearts to love instead of fear, loving ourselves and others enough that forgiveness is possible. When we're bold and brave and clumsy, as I was, we often make mistakes. And that's part of being human. And acknowledging that keeps us humble. And yet the fallout from what happened in those workshops I was facilitating, in the fallout, the hardest part was forgiving myself. having compassion for myself so that I could offer a compassionate response and seek forgiveness from the ones I'd hurt. One of the lessons those experiences taught me is about the difference between intention and impact. My intention was good. My co-facilitator seemed to be struggling to explain something, and so I jumped in, I thought, to help. But the impact was this. My co-facilitator and some of the participants experienced me, a white person, taking over and trying to explain something the way that I thought it should be explained. The impact was not good. When you find yourself saying out loud or to yourself, "But I didn't mean it that way," it's an opportunity to stop and ask yourself what the impact was. It got messy, and I hurt someone. But what I had to learn was that I am not a horrible person because of it. If I couldn't find a way to forgive myself and then ask for forgiveness from others, we wouldn't have been able to move forward in our work to transform ourselves and change the world. And we have done so, remaining on the journey together to this day. I would imagine we've all had the uncomfortable experience of putting our foot in our mouth. Anybody else other than me? Okay, good, yeah. Or of acting with the best of intentions and being told that despite our good intentions, the impact was harmful. When this happens, we can respond in a number of ways. We can move forward as if nothing happened, though that's rarely successful. We can get defensive, though that is rarely successful. Or we can acknowledge what occurred, change course, and seek forgiveness. Dilruba Ahmed's poem, Phase 1, refers to the first phase of forgiveness, which is forgiving ourselves. Her poem is a litany of all the things that she holds against herself: fridge doors left open, dying plants, lost bags, feeling awkward, failing to show someone the compassion that they deserve. And by repeating, "I forgive you, I forgive you, I forgive you," she is practicing being the person she wants to be in the world, a person of love. I read an interview with the poet in which she explained the origin of this poem. At the time the poem emerged, she was struggling with anger and resentment about the political situation in our country, and had been thinking a lot about the notion of self-forgiveness as a precursor to broader forgiveness. She was, in her words, fumbling for a way forward in a country so bitterly divided across political lines. And so she realized that the understanding of forgiveness that we might hope to extend to others must begin within. To change ourselves, we must forgive ourselves so that we can be freed to move forward and not get bogged down in self-criticism or perfectionism. We're all imperfect in our own way. And so learning how to forgive ourselves and practicing this regularly helps us respond better to the imperfections of others and to forgive them. Forgiving ourselves and forgiving others both involve a change within. As the Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote, forgiving is not something we do for another person. He said, forgiving happens inside us. It represents a letting go of the sense of grievance, and perhaps most importantly, a letting go of the role of victim. May we, as a people of faith, be granted the strength to be so bold, so brave, and so loving. So what in our Unitarian Universalist faith gives us this strength to be so loving enough that we can forgive ourselves and others when life gets uncomfortable and messy? One source is our first principle, which calls on us to respect the worth and dignity that is inherent in all people, in you and me. Our belief that all of us carry the potential to do good, that we are good at the core of our being, this leads us to approach each other with reverence and respect. We affirm each week that love is the doctrine of our church. What is the origin of that love? Some would say it comes from within, or it comes from our experiences of connection with others. It comes from the God of many names. and it grows within the interdependent web of all creation, of which we are a part and to which we are responsible. A colleague said to me recently, "We cannot forgive without a sense of connection to something larger, to something beyond ourselves." She said, "We cannot forgive by our will alone." And I agree. It's hard to simply will ourselves to forgive when we've been wronged. There has to be something, which some call God and some call love, that transforms our hearts and makes forgiveness possible. Each of us must find a spiritual practice that helps us to cultivate this sense of connection and this force of transformation within us. For me, one of those practices is being in religious community, whether in worship or in small groups or engaged in our work for justice, and navigating the bold discomfort and brave clumsiness that happens here. It helps me to see and feel that connection to something larger than myself, and I see myself in it and it in me. Another practice for me is being in nature. It helps me cultivate this feeling of being a part of something much larger even than humanity. A creation that somehow, through wondrous processes and despite humanity's inconsistent care for it, achieves such beauty and harmony again and again. A couple weeks ago, Reverend Ruth talked about our purpose as a religious community being to grow our souls and heal the world. And we do this in part through love and forgiveness. While the word forgiveness is not named in our affirmation, I really do believe it's an implied part of our covenant with one another. If our lives and our community are to be guided by love and striving for peace to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine, we can't do that without forgiveness now and then. The writer Anne Lamott says the earth is a forgiveness school. She says, "I really believe that's why they brought us here and then left us without an owner's manual. I think we're here to learn forgiveness. For me," she says, "it all begins with the hardest work of all, of being so crazily imperfect." And of course, Lamott is known for her writing that highlights this imperfection in both humorous and meaningful ways. The earth is a forgiveness school, and so is our church community. It's a place where we can learn and practice forgiveness, cultivating that love muscle inside of us so that over time it becomes a little easier. When our church marks Yom Kippur, the holiday of atonement that begins the Jewish New Year, we recite a litany together with the response, "We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love." Can we promise this to one another? Forgiving ourselves and each other and beginning again in love? I think we must if we are to grow our souls and transform the world. When I panicked in response to my clumsiness as a workshop facilitator, I was convinced in that moment that I alone had to fix the situation. But I've learned we will navigate the discomfort and the messiness together. That's why we're here with each other. We have so much to cherish about each other and this community that will light our way through. So may it be so, and may we do this for each other and with each other. Amen.